Hi everyone. For today's lesson, we're going to go over just some types of AP poetry or just types of poetry that will show up on the AP exam. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, so there are definitely types that we won't cover, but these are some that most commonly come up or just that are the maybe easiest to identify and tackle first. So we'll be going over 8 types of poetry. These are lyrics, odes, ballads, sonnets, elegies. The next one goes by 2 names. You might either see it as an idyll or a pastoral poem. 7th one is called a Carpe Diem, and then the last one is an epic poem. So our first type that we'll go over together is a lyric poem. This is where something is subjective and maybe a little bit reflective of that author itself. It will typically have a regular rhyme scheme and meter. And it shows what the poet is thinking and feeling to have a very solid impression of what's going on at the time. So some examples, if you're curious to look up more, ones that we might come across together would be To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, Harlem by Langston Hughes. We'll be studying that a lot with A Raisin in the Sun. And Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is that poem by Emily Dickinson, which we have used to practice together with meter in class. The second type is an ode. An ode usually has a kind of elaborate verse to it, so meaning that it has a lot of language that's meant to depict things. It's not always the most straightforward syntax. It's a little bit more complex. Regular rhyme scheme and meter though, so just saying that it's complex does not necessarily mean that it's all over the place. Like we've seen with Shakespeare, that's complex writing, but it has a very regular pattern to it. Odes are almost always often about serious topics, some sort of dignified theme. So it's always referencing somebody or something that the poet finds very important and worth commemorating within this poem. This one is sometimes easy to find because oftentimes the title of the poem will let you know that it's an ode. So some examples we have are Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to the West Wind. You might see that come up very quickly in the title, so then you know what to look for. The next type is a ballad. You might have heard this term for music as well when people talk about power ballads and things like that, so that could be some helpful contextual information. Ballad is usually more simple and it has a narrative verse, meaning that it is meant to tell a story more so than get across, some very highbrow theme. And so with that in mind, it's really meant to be sung or recited, so ballads are not necessarily meant just to be printed, published, and read. It is meant to be performed either through speaking or singing. Some examples, one by John Keats, La Belle Dame sans Merci, The Fiddler of Dooney by William Butler Yeats. Next one is sonnet. That should sound familiar from our brief work together on one of Shakespeare's sonnets as well. A sonnet will always have 14 lines, so that's the easiest thing. If you are given a poem on the AP exam and you see that it has specifically 14 lines, you can give it a pretty safe bet that it will most likely be a sonnet. There are a few different types. This first type is often described as a Shakespearean sonnet, but you might also see it described as an English sonnet. That is one that is written in iambic pentameter, has 3 quatrains. Reminder, a quatrain is a group of 4 lines followed by a couplet, which is just a pair of 2 lines. And the rhyme scheme for a Shakespearean sonnet is AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. So here, right, we see these grouped into quatrains and then a couplet at the end. So for example, one of the most famous ones is the Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day. There are also Petrarchan or Italian sonnets. So here we see in both types that they are either referred to by their most famous user or by the nationality of that poet. So Petrarchan sonnet is still 14 lines, but structured a little bit differently. Instead of 3 quatrains and a couplet, it's an octave, which is a group of 8 lines, and a sestet, which is a group of 6 lines. So the rhyme scheme looks a little bit different. We have ABBA, ABBA, which this is considered an octave, even though it's split here to look like quatrains, because this exact pattern repeats. That's an octave. Same here at the end with the sestet, where it's CDE, CDE. Few examples of that one. although it is called an Italian sonnet and it was started by Petrarch, these examples are both from English authors. So it's not that one type of sonnet is exclusively relegated to a certain nationality or another. It's just more about where it started. So John Milton and John Donne, both famous English poets. So we have John Milton's On His Blindness and John Donne, Death Be Not Proud. Our next type is an elegy. An elegy is a poem that specifically is talking about death. So the easiest way to find this with sonnets, the easiest way to discover one is through the structure of it. With elegies and then sometimes ballads and odes, it's easiest to discover it through what the subject matter is talking about. So we've got some examples there. Sometimes you have clues in the title again, like with the odes, we often see that in the title. Here you see Elegy for Jane, or In Memoriam, right, which is a pretty good clue that it's going to be about death as well. Next one is either referred to as an idyll or a pastoral poem. This is another form of lyric poetry, meaning that it is meant to kind of portray a certain image. The sound of it is very important, the way it is read, the way it is sung. And it's specifically describing the life of a shepherd. Sometimes it is expanded upon a little bit, but even so, it would still be specifically about being outside, nature, things like that. And it's very idealistic. It takes a very romanticized view of nature and working outside, praising it, not seeing it as outdated or old-fashioned or anything. So like we said, makes country life look pleasant. So rather than being removed and distant, it's portrayed as something positive and enlightening most often. So some examples, again, poets making it easy for us. Idylls of the King, obvious clue. Solitary Reaper would be another one. Our second to last type of poem we're talking about together today is a Carpe Diem. If you're familiar with what that phrase means, seize the day, that'll help you immensely with discovering what type of poem this is. It's really just a poem that tells the speaker or the audience to seize the day. So often we see it in terms of the speaker of the poem encouraging someone else to do something because life is short and uncertain and, take advantage of what you can. Themes and topics like that are a pretty good indicator that this will be a Carpe Diem poem. So examples, to his coy mistress, we might go over that one together. That one is basically just one guy speaking to his mistress about what she should do since life is short. Same here, to the virgins to make much of time. Confessional poetry. Sorry, I don't think I put this on the title slide, but this is another important one. Confessional poetry most often comes up within postmodernism, which was a big movement during the mid-20th century in America. It's very personal, thus the word confessional, and it typically, because it is personal, addresses topics that were not seen at the forefront of conversation at the time. So mental illness, sexuality, suicide, all things that were kind of swept under the rug, kept taboo. People would only whisper about them, not really speak out loud. So this was a form of poetry that really kind of highlighted that and broke down, not all, but definitely some stigma around talking about these things. So there are a few very famous poets who worked a lot on this. Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Allen Ginsberg, all fit into that more postmodern time period. So that will be one of the more recent forms of poetry that we talked about. And now the last one. For an epic poem, it's one that's very, very long. So epic poems are usually accidentally called books because they are very long. They look like a book. So for example, things like the Odyssey or Beowulf are technically epic poems. Because it's so long, it is very much so a narrative. It tells a story about a hero and his journey. So yeah, Odyssey by Homer, Divine Comedy would be another one, Paradise Lost, another very famous one. So those are our types of poems. Make sure that you're good to go on your notes and just annotate any questions you have so we can talk together in class.